Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and because today is Thursday, we are talking about science fiction and fantasy. If you weren't aware, I do have a little bit of an unspoken schedule on my channel. So on Tuesdays, I always post what I call stabby videos, which are horror thrillers and true crime. And then on Thursdays, I post videos about science fiction as well as fantasy. And I try to do that because I know I kind of have two different audiences that typically like one genre and not the other. So I try to have them separate so you can pick and choose the videos that are interest to you. But of course, I do have videos like TBRs and book hauls that do cross over into all the genres that I read. But for the most part, if it's a Tuesday, expect the stories to be stabby. If it's a Thursday, expect them to be in space or in a fantasy world. Anyway, because it's Thursday, again, we're talking science fiction, fantasy, and while I'm talking SFF today, it's kind of going to bleed a little bit into my creepy picks because of the fact that I'm currently trying to read all of the disturbing and messed up books out there, and I've been focusing on that in my horror and stabby videos. However, I started to wonder, are there disturbing and messed up science fiction books? And the answer is yes. So I have one of them included in this video, and I'd love to get recommendations for even more messed up science fiction books that I should read. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about some new release science fiction, and I read The City Inside by Samit Basu. This is a book I received for review from Tor Books and Tor.com, and this is a very short novel that is set in a dystopian future. It is set in New Delhi, and we follow a young woman who works as a social media influencer manager. So she is not the social influencer herself, but she actually manages the accounts of lots of celebrities. Now, this is a dystopian in the sense of something like 1984, where we have a government that is controlling everyone's communications and thoughts and really providing surveillance over their citizens in order, again, to keep them in control and in line. So I like that it plays with those very classic themes, but because this book is so centered around social media, it also feels incredibly modern. And I really enjoyed the world building within this. So you get really interesting descriptions about how social media is used, how it just incorporates every aspect of their lives, and really I think that while this is technically a near future story, it feels like it in some ways could almost be in the present day, because especially what's happening over in China, there really is a lot of government influence over the social media and just that pressure to be careful what you're saying out loud and what you're saying online and all of that, because it is getting watched. And so I think this book is incredibly topical. And again, I love the world building. I thought it was fresh. I love the own voices perspective. I really enjoyed New Delhi as a focal point to the story, and I love so many aspects to it. I will say that the plot almost kind of falls to the wayside, like it's kind of a secondary aspect to everything else I loved about the book, but I thought the characters were rich. I thought the story was just imaginative and how it was drawn and depicted. So if you love dystopian novels, if you're looking for something new, because typically, unless you're going to delve into YA, in my opinion, I feel like you have to go back to the classics to read a lot of dystopian these days. So it was really nice to see one that was published right here in 2022 that is so topical and definitely worth reading. Next, we have Dare to Know by James Kennedy, which is a book I received for review from Quirk Books. And this is a sci-fi thriller that's very light on the science elements, or the hard science at least. Instead, it's a story that focuses around a man who works in a job where he knows when people are going to die, and it's his job to tell them when they're going to die, and that of course changes the trajectory of their life. And within the story, he finds out when he is supposed to die. However, that point or that time has already passed, and so we get to puzzle out what's happening, because of course the system is supposed to be very, very accurate, and it is not. I enjoyed this one. I thought it was very interesting. It was very fast paced. The narrative moved at a good clip. I enjoyed the parts of the beginning where you kind of flash back to his childhood, a bit of a coming of age narrative at the beginning. And I was looking at the other reviews, and a lot of people said the main character is really unlikable. And again, maybe this is because I read so many thrillers and horror books, but I didn't think the guy was that bad. I thought he was just a complex, interesting dude, and I didn't have a problem with him. But again, maybe because he's not a serial killer, maybe that's why that I didn't mind him too much. So I personally would recommend this one. I feel like it's underhyped, and it was a really fun, fast, easy read. And again, very accessible for beginners to science fiction, because it really doesn't get into the science of how this supposed, ability to tell someone's death works. Instead, it's just a concept, and then the story just goes from there. Next up, we have Under Fortunate Stars by Hutchings, and this is a book that I received for review from Rebellion Publishing. And this is a space opera that is set in a future where humanity is at war with another entity. We specifically follow a group of people on a ship, so kind of this like ragtag group of people who are trying to escape the war, and they come across another ship, and this ship supposedly is from the future. And this is interesting because from the future ship's perspective, they believe that these people that they have run across are actually really important historical figures and are going to play a really important role in ending the war. However, what they are seeing and what they have heard in their history textbooks don't really match up. So I think that this is a book with a really interesting concept. In terms of tone, I'm going to say that it's very light and very jokey. There's a lot of banter between the characters. And so I think if you like something a little bit lighter, like think the Axiom trilogy by Tim Pratt, or perhaps something like the Wayfarer series, but with a little bit more plot, this is the kind of tone you're going to get from this book. I will say that I really like the premise of this book, but in terms of the execution, in terms of kind of the reveals and figuring out what is all going on, it wasn't quite what I expected. I understand now where the author was going with it. It wasn't totally to my taste, but if you're intrigued by this book, you might want to check it out for yourself, depending on how your tastes align with mine or, differ. So keep that all in mind. Now, moving on to backlist science fiction, this is where I start to delve into some messed up sci-fi, and I read The Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, and this is a piece of classic dystopian fiction that I've wanted to read for a really long time. If you don't know, the basic setup is that we follow a group of young people that are in sort of a gang, and they basically just go around being incredibly vulgar and violent and do terrible, terrible things. This is a book that I tried to read back in high school. I read a few pages and I thought that it was a really, really cool book, but I just didn't feel like I was ready for it as a reader. I was definitely someone who felt like I was a weaker reader back in the day, which is crazy to say now, but I wanted to read the story, but I thought that I would read it one day in the future when I was older, and well, now that I'm in my 30s, I decided that that day had come. So I picked it up and I really enjoyed it. So if you're not familiar, this book basically reinvents the English language. There is so much slang that in some ways this book is almost incomprehensible, but it is so well done that as long as you're paying attention to the book, it's actually quite easy to figure out, for the most part, what they're actually talking about, what they're referencing, and the slang just makes sense within, again, the context of the story. So I've got to give the author huge credit because it's a book that kind of reads like gibberish, but once you get into it, you kind of forget that it's reading all in slang, and I thought it was incredibly well done. I did decide to do this one on audio because I found a really good audiobook performance, and again, I think it helped to really bring the slang to life, and by getting to hear the author's inflection, I think that again it helped with the context, but I found this book very gripping. I flew through it in just a couple days and would definitely recommend it. If you're intimidated by classics, don't worry, so am I. I don't read a lot of classics, but that's more so because I always think that classics are like Pride and Prejudice, which just, you can probably guess, isn't really my thing. I'm not really into romance and gothic stories of that nature and all that. But when it comes to weird, messed up books, I'm all for it. So I really want to check this one out, and I'm really happy to say that it definitely lived up to the hype. Definitely one that I would consider rereading because I do think I get more and more out of it each time I read. It wasn't quite a 5-star read, at least on this first pass, but definitely one that I could see loving more and more each time I read it. Next up, we have Dichronauts by Greg Egan, and this is a story that is really hard to summarize, I'll be honest. Basically, it's set in a near future, and this is a book that plays with a lot of hard scientific ideas, specifically involving math and geometry. So at the beginning of the story, we follow a family that are going out to watch this building that is getting moved by movers, like physically moving the building. And the ideas introduced within the story involving geometry honestly just blew my mind. It was so interesting. However, the story itself, I did feel was lacking. I thought the characters were very flat, and the story just kind of felt like filler. I felt like the author had some really cool ideas he wanted to explore on the page, and then afterwards kind of wrote a story around those ideas in order to call it a novel and not like a scientific paper. But this is a book that I picked up because of my friend Mike at Fit to Be Read, and I'm going to link his channel down below because a lot of people say that if they like my channel, it's often because they enjoy that I read more science fiction than fantasy. And if you're one of those people and are looking for more more booktubers that focus on science fiction. He's definitely one you want to check out. Great friend of mine, great content. He does far more elaborate setups in terms of green screens and video, art and music and all these kind of things that I will never be able to do. So if you enjoy those details, I think you will really enjoy his channel. He's a lot of fun. Definitely recommend him. But the reason that he recommended this book to me was because of my love of The Inverted World by Christopher Priest, which also deals with a lot of similar scientific ideas. I definitely see the comparison there, and I'm glad I read this one, but I'll be honest, I do still prefer The Inverted World because, again, I think it's a stronger story in terms of the actual narrative, the characters, the coming of age story. I think just worked better on the page as an actual novel. But definitely glad I read this one. It hurt my brain, but in a good way. So if you enjoy really hard science fiction, you definitely want to check out Greg Egan. And I don't always talk about rereads, but I do occasionally like to do so when my opinion of a book changes. So I want to mention that I just reread Shadow and Claw and the 2 sequels, Sword and Citadel. These are the bind-ups of the Book of the New Sun series, all by Wolfe. And I previously reviewed these on my channel back, I believe, last year when this Tour Essentials line came out. But I got a chance to reread them via the audio, which is done by Jonathan Davis. I love him. And I'm really glad I revisited these ones because I got a lot more out of them the second time around. The first time I reviewed these, I was reluctant to even tell you what the books were about. I described them as science fiction that reads like fantasy, and I will still say that that is true, but the piece that I do want to let people know is that this essentially is a regressed society, so that's where the science fiction elements come in. And at first I thought that it's something that I should almost keep secret, but rereading this series, I realized that if you read the series without knowing that, you miss so much. And so I do think on the second read through, once I was looking for those details, once I was looking for those hints of the regressed society and the hints of the future, it was so much more fun. So I will say that this series has definitely gone way up in my enjoyment level the second time around. I would really recommend it, again, to people who perhaps do prefer fantasy and are looking to get into science fiction. I think it's very accessible, but for those that really enjoy a detailed, dense read with beautiful prose, this one is really a treasure, and I do see why people love these books so much. Again, it's a series I want to read and reread again over and over again, as so many people do. If you're looking for more detailed synopsis, I know that my friend Mike from Fit to Be Read has talked about these books, and I also want to recommend Moid's channel, which is, I believe, Death Cult. He butchered my name in his video, so I'm going to butcher his here. Death Metal Cult, that's not right. Death Media Cult, there we go. And again, if you're looking for someone who reads a lot of science fiction, you definitely want to check him out. I feel like everyone who watches my videos probably already watches his, but just in case, please go check him out. And I know that he's done in-depth discussions with spoilers on these, so I will point you in his direction because I won't be able to provide much more detail here without going into spoilers. All right, moving on. Then we have a science fiction fantasy crossover, and that is The Blood Trials by N.E. Davenport. And this is another 2022 release, and this is one I wanted to check out because I'd heard great things about it. I heard a really gushing review from Bethany over at her channel, Bookish Bethany, so I'll link down below if I remember. But her review is going to be a little bit different than mine. I will agree with her that it is a very dark book. I should start with the synopsis. Essentially, we follow a woman who is in this future society, so it is again set in like a far-flung future world, but this book also has magic, which also makes it a form of fantasy. And we follow her and her friends, and they are embarking in their military careers. You find out that her grandfather has passed away, and so she is grieving that. However, right at the beginning of the story, so again, it's not a spoiler, you find out that possibly her grandfather did not die of natural causes, possibly he was murdered, and so the story turns into a revenge story. Now, the part that a lot of other reviewers will discuss, and everyone seems to have a different opinion on this, is whether or not this book should be classified as young adult. Now, if you know my channel, I really only read adult science fiction fantasy. It's just my preference, no salt to anyone who prefers YA or young adult, but for me, I just prefer adult. However, this book was classified as adult, so I picked it up, but I will say that it did read like YA. Now, the place that other people like Bethany will disagree is they'll say that it doesn't read like YA because it gets really dark and deals with a lot of adult subject matter. However, when I say a book reads like YA, I'm talking about tone, not so much the subject matter. So I'm going to make an argument that I don't know if I've ever made on camera, but my thing is that a book can still read like young adult even if it has plenty of adult subject matter in it, because there's a difference between a book being adult and simply a book being a young adult book that is inappropriate. So I would not put this book into the hands of a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old. Don't get me wrong, it's very inappropriate. There's lots of swearing, there is lots of different adult content that comes into this book. It gets very dark in terms of subject matter, but it still felt like a YA book, just totally inappropriate to give to a teenager, if that makes sense. So hopefully you understand where this is coming from. So I'll say that if you read both adult and young adult, this book might appeal to you. If you only read adult like myself, you'll probably find that this book just feels really young, and that might affect your reading experience. Keep that all in mind. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this topic down below. Do you agree with me that a book can feel like young adult no matter how dark and gritty it tries to go, if the characters just still feel young and the narrative voice just feels like it's written for a younger audience, even if they're swearing their, little ears off? Anyway, moving right along. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? Don't forget that I mentioned a few other booktubers. I'm gonna try to do more shout outs again. I've gotten out of the habit. I'm gonna try to get back to that. So again, if you want more science fiction, check out Mike and Moid. And if you want more kind of fantasy and different diverse reviews, I definitely recommend you check out Bethany's channel, because again, while we kind of disagree on that book, I have so much respect for her as a reviewer. And if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of adult science fiction, fantasy, as well as horror and thrillers. I would also love for you to recommend me disturbing science fiction books, and I'd love to hear your experience reading YA books or adult books that read like YA. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that little discussion I talked about there. If you're still with me, thank you so much. You can give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if just a little emoji like a spaceship or a rocket ship. And if you want to help me out even more, you can hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.